The file is opened. This is not a story of a hunt, a chase, or a public spectacle. It is a descent into a quiet, private hell, one built brick by brick under the floorboards of a normal house, on a normal street, by a man who was, to the world, a normal husband, father, and grandfather. This is a case that forces us to confront the abyss that can exist not in the shadows of society, but in the very heart of the family. The Josef Fritzl case, entering the mind of a monster who abused his own daughter for decades. Chapter 1. The Cellar of the Soul. In the small, immaculately orderly town of Amstetten, Austria, a place of neat gardens, quiet cobblestone streets, and the comforting, predictable chime of church bells, there stood an unremarkable grey apartment building at 40 Yibstrasse. It was a place like any other, a building that held the scent of cooking and the faint sounds of televisions, home to ordinary families living ordinary lives. The landlord and owner was a seemingly unremarkable man named Josef Fritzl, a retired electrical engineer in his early 70s. He was known in the community as a stern, sometimes difficult, but ultimately respectable figure, a husband, a father of 7, and a doting grandfather. To his tenants and neighbors, he was just another part of the town's quiet, unchanging backdrop. But beneath the utterly mundane surface of this man and this house lay a secret so monstrous, so profoundly depraved, that its discovery in the spring of April 2008 would not just shock a town, but would send a seismic tremor of horror across the entire world, forcing us to question the very nature of what lies behind a neighbor's closed door. The story that unfolded was not one of a fleeting, violent act of passion or a chaotic crime spree. It was the story of a slow, suffocating, and meticulously engineered nightmare that lasted for 24 years, or 8,742 days. For nearly a quarter of a century, Josef Fritzl held his own daughter, Elizabeth, captive in a custom-built, soundproofed cellar hidden deep beneath the family home. In this windowless, airless dungeon, he subjected her to a regimen of unimaginable physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, fathering 7 children with her in the suffocating darkness. 3 of these children would live their entire lives in the cellar, their world defined by concrete walls and the hum of a ventilation fan, never seeing sunlight, never knowing a sky, a tree, or another human face beyond their immediate family of captives. In a twist of unparalleled cruelty, 3 other children were brought upstairs to be raised by Fritzl and his unsuspecting wife, Rosemarie, under the cruel and elaborate fiction that they were foundlings, abandoned on their doorstep by their tragically wayward, cult-member daughter. This is not the story of a hunt for a monster. It is the story of a monster who was hiding in plain sight, a man who attended community events and disciplined his upstairs grandchildren while his other family languished in a tomb of his own creation. The case of Josef Fritzl forces us to confront one of the most terrifying truths of human nature, that the most profound evil does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it wears the mask of a patriarch, a provider, a grandfather. We will descend into the physical and psychological architecture of this private hell, to explore the mind of a man who built a kingdom of absolute control in the cellar of his own soul, and to understand how such a thing could exist silently and secretly for so long, right under our feet. Chapter 2. The Forging of a Tyrant. To understand the man who would build a prison for his own daughter, we must travel back to the psychological ruins of post-war Austria, a nation wrestling with its own dark past and a culture of secrets. Josef Fritzl was born in Amstetten in 1935, a child of the Anschluss and the Second World War. His upbringing, as he would later describe it, was not one of warmth or stability, but a brutal education in power dynamics. His father, a distant figure, abandoned the family when he was a young boy, leaving him to be raised solely by his mother, a woman he would later describe with a chilling, undiluted venom as the wickedest woman alive and a slave driver. He claimed she beat him relentlessly and without reason, that he lived in a constant state of fear of her unpredictable rage, and that he received no love, no affection, no validation, only punishment and humiliation. This childhood, whether entirely true or a narcissistic exaggeration designed to elicit sympathy, was a crucible of humiliation and absolute powerlessness. He was the weak, unwanted son, completely at the mercy of a tyrannical matriarch. This dynamic became the foundational trauma of his life, the central wound around which his entire personality would form. It instilled in him a deep-seated volcanic rage and a pathological, all-consuming craving for the one thing he felt he never had: absolute power and unquestionable control. He vowed, consciously or subconsciously, that he would never be powerless again. He would spend the rest of his life reversing that dynamic. He would become the one who inflicted fear, not the one who felt it. As a young man, he appeared to be a model of post-war industriousness. He pursued an education in electrical engineering, a field that rewards precision, logic, and a deep understanding of systems of control. He was intelligent and technically capable. He married his wife, Rosemarie, in 1956, and together they began to build a large family, eventually having 7 children. To the outside world, he was the picture of a successful provider, a man who worked hard, maintained a respectable home, and fulfilled his duties. He was meticulously building the facade of the perfect, stern Austrian patriarch, a figure of authority in his home and community. But beneath this veneer of respectable normalcy, the psychological damage of his childhood was festering and metastasizing. He ruled his own family with the same iron fist he claimed his mother had used on him, recreating the power structure he both hated and admired. He was the undisputed king of the household at 40 Ibstrasse. His word was law, his temper a weapon. His children and his wife learned early on to obey him without question, to walk on eggshells around his volatile moods, to never challenge his authority. He was creating a miniature totalitarian state within the 4 walls of his own home, a place where his control was absolute and his ego was supreme. The town of Amstetten, with its conservative Catholic values and its powerful emphasis on family privacy and patriarchal authority, provided the perfect, unwitting backdrop for his growing tyranny. In this culture, no one questioned what went on behind a man's closed doors. This cultural silence would become his greatest and most enduring accomplice. Chapter 3. The Blueprint for a Dungeon. The darkness within Josef Fritzl did not manifest suddenly on that fateful day in 1984. It had been revealing itself in smaller but deeply significant acts for decades, like tremors before an earthquake. In 1967, long before he became the infamous monster of Amstetten, Fritzl was arrested, tried, and convicted of the rape of a 24-year-old nurse at knife point in Linz. He was also charged with attempted rape and indecent exposure in other incidents. He served only a fraction of his 18-month sentence. This early violent crime was a crucial indicator of his predatory nature, his lack of empathy, and his capacity for brutal sexual domination. It was a dress rehearsal for the horrors to come, a test of his ability to exert his will over another human being through absolute terror. The leniency of the justice system at the time, combined with laws that allowed his criminal record to be expunged after a certain period, effectively erased his past. This legal whitewashing allowed him to obtain permits for his guest house and to continue building his facade of respectability, a clean slate that hid a dirty soul. His tyrannical control over his family was also a form of long-term preparation, a slow tightening of the psychological screws. He instilled in his wife, Rosemarie, and their 7 children, a culture of absolute obedience and fear. Disobedience was met with severe punishment, and questioning his authority was unthinkable. He was particularly obsessed with his daughter, Elizabeth. As she grew into a vibrant teenager, she began to rebel, as teenagers do. She tried to run away from his suffocating control on multiple occasions, seeking a small taste of the freedom her friends enjoyed. Each attempt was met with stricter rules, harsher punishments, and a terrifying escalation of his possessiveness. In his twisted, narcissistic mind, her natural desire for a normal life was not a phase of adolescence. It was an act of high treason against his absolute authority, an unforgivable betrayal that had to be crushed. He was determined to break her spirit and possess her, body and soul. The idea for the cellar did not come in a flash of mad inspiration. It was the culmination of years of dark fantasy and meticulous, patient planning. Starting in the late 1970s, Fritzl, the skilled and methodical engineer, began a secret construction project in the basement of his home. He told his wife and the authorities he needed more storage space and a workshop for his hobbies. Over several years, he secretly and laboriously extended the cellar, excavating tons of earth and pouring concrete by hand, often working late into the night. He created a hidden, windowless complex of small, claustrophobic rooms, accessible only through a series of 8 locked, reinforced doors. The final door was a masterpiece of malevolent deception, a 300-kilogram, steel-reinforced concrete door, only 50 centimeters high, concealed behind a shelf in his workshop and operated by a secret, remote-controlled electronic code that only he knew. This was not just construction. It was the creation of a private kingdom, a purpose-built dungeon designed for one purpose only, to permanently imprison another human being. Every detail was planned with the chilling foresight of an engineer building a machine. He ran electrical and ventilation lines to keep his captives alive. He installed a rudimentary toilet and shower. He painstakingly soundproofed the walls with layers of insulation and carpet to ensure that no scream, no cry for help could ever escape to the world above. While his family lived their normal lives just a few meters above, he was building the physical manifestation of his psychopathic need for control. A concrete tomb where he could finally become the absolute, unquestioned God of his own dark universe. Chapter 4. The Descent into Darkness. On August 28, 1984, the blueprint became a horrific reality. Josef Fritzl put the final, horrifying piece of his long-term, meticulously planned project into motion. Elizabeth was 18 years old, a young woman on the cusp of adulthood, with a job as a waitress and a life of her own finally beginning to take shape beyond her father's oppressive gaze. This growing independence, this flicker of freedom, was a threat Fritzl could not and would not tolerate. He decided it was time to reclaim what he saw as his property for good. He lured her down to the newly completed cellar under the most mundane of false pretexts, asking her to help him carry a heavy door he had just installed. It was a simple domestic request, one she had no reason to refuse from her own father. As she stepped into the dimly lit basement, the trap sprang shut with terrifying speed. Fritzl used a cloth soaked in ether to overpower her and render her unconscious. When she awoke, her reality had been irrevocably shattered. She was no longer a daughter in her family home. She was a prisoner in a cold, concrete tomb. She was chained to a post, her hands bound, her world reduced to a few square meters of darkness and silence. The psychological shock of this ultimate betrayal is almost impossible for a sane mind to comprehend. The father who was meant to protect her, the man who gave her life, had become her captor, her jailer, her absolute tormentor. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, Fritzl began the systematic process of breaking her will, of erasing her identity and replacing it with total submission. He subjected her to repeated, brutal rapes, establishing his absolute physical and sexual domination. He controlled every single aspect of her existence, when she ate, when she slept, when the single light bulb was turned on or off. He was now the undisputed god of her universe, the sole arbiter of her reality, the only human contact she would have, to complete his masterful deception for the world above. He forced the traumatized Elizabeth to write a letter to her parents. In the letter, penned under extreme duress, she was made to explain that she had grown tired of her life, had run away to join a mysterious religious cult, and that they should not, under any circumstances, look for her. This letter was the cornerstone of his alibi for the next 24 years. Rosemarie and the rest of the family, conditioned by years of Fritzl's tyranny, and perhaps wanting to believe a simpler, less painful truth, accepted the story. They filed a missing person report, but the letter gave them and the police a reason not to search too hard. Their daughter was not missing in the traditional sense. She had chosen to leave. While the family upstairs mourned, in their own way, the loss of a runaway daughter, that same daughter was living a nightmare existence of unspeakable horror, just a few meters below their feet, a prisoner in a world of one. The descent into darkness was complete. Chapter 5. The Unsuspecting Town. The disappearance and subsequent 24-year-long imprisonment of Josef Fritzl is a story of monstrous individual evil, but it is also a deeply unsettling story about the nature of a community. After the truth was revealed in 2008, the world's attention turned not just to Josef Fritzl, but to the small, quiet, and deeply conservative town of Amstetten. A single, agonizing question hung in the air, repeated in headlines around the globe. How could this have happened? How could a man imprison his daughter and the children he fathered with her for nearly a quarter of a century, in the center of a European town without anyone knowing? The reaction from the residents of Amstetten was a complex mixture of profound shock, genuine disbelief, and a deep collective sense of shame and defensiveness. They were horrified that their tranquil, orderly town had become the setting for such a grotesque and sensational story, its name now a global synonym for depravity. Many residents reacted defensively, lashing out at the international media. They insisted that Fritzl was just a singular monster, an aberration that could have appeared anywhere. They rejected the idea that there was something uniquely Austrian or Amstetten about the crime, particularly in the face of media narratives that were quick to draw parallels to other high-profile Austrian kidnapping cases, like that of Natascha Kampusch, creating a disturbing Austrian cellar trope. Journalists from around the world descended upon the town, turning Ibstrasse 40 into a grim tourist attraction. They camped out for weeks, interviewing neighbors, tenants, and anyone who had ever known Fritzl, desperately trying to find someone who had suspected something was amiss. But the answers were almost universally the same. Fritzl was seen as a bit of a tyrant, a difficult and controlling landlord, an unpleasant man to cross, but no one could have possibly imagined the scale of the horror he was concealing. He had expertly cultivated an image that, while not friendly, was well within the accepted bounds of normalcy for a conservative, authoritarian patriarch of his generation in that particular cultural context. This case forced a painful and necessary period of introspection in Austria about a culture that some critics describe as prioritizing family privacy to the point of willful ignorance, a deep-seated tendency to look away from what happens behind a neighbor's closed doors. Did tenants or neighbors hear suspicious noises over the years? Some reports suggest they did, but they were dismissed as plumbing issues or the sounds of a workshop. Did Rosemarie, his wife, who lived in the house every single day, truly suspect nothing? The official investigation concluded she did not, portraying her as another long-term victim of Fritzl's decades-long campaign of psychological domination, manipulation, and deceit. The story of Amstetten is a chilling cautionary tale about how the mundane can be a perfect cloak for the monstrous. The assumption of normalcy, the powerful respect for a man's home as his unassailable castle, and the cultural reluctance to interfere created a perfect environment of silence in which Josef Fritzl's private hell could flourish, undetected for an entire generation, Chapter 6. The Knock of Fate. For 24 years, Josef Fritzl's secret, subterranean kingdom remained impenetrable, his control absolute. But in the spring of 2008, the one thing that even he could not control brought his meticulously constructed world crashing down. Illness. Kerstin, the eldest of the cellar children, then 19 years old, fell gravely ill. She was suffering from a mysterious and life-threatening condition, experiencing violent seizures and slipping in and out of consciousness. Elizabeth, terrified of losing her daughter and having already lost one infant son in the cellar, begged and pleaded with her father to seek medical help. This was a direct challenge to his authority, born of the ultimate maternal instinct. Fritzl was now faced with an impossible, terrifying dilemma. To let Kerstin die in the cellar risked a potential mutiny from Elizabeth and the other children, and it would present the logistical nightmare of disposing of a body. But to take her to a hospital meant risking total, catastrophic exposure. It meant bringing a young woman with no medical records, no identity, no history, and a host of strange, unexplainable symptoms into the public healthcare system. In a fateful gamble, driven by a bizarre mix of narcissistic self-preservation and perhaps a flicker of something resembling concern, he chose the hospital. On April 19, 2008, he carried Kerstin's unconscious body out of the cellar and drove her to a local hospital. He stuck to his old narrative, claiming he had found her on his doorstep, left there by her runaway mother Elizabeth, along with a desperate handwritten note. This was the beginning of the end. The doctors at the hospital were immediately and deeply suspicious. Kerstin was pale as a ghost from lack of sunlight. Her teeth were rotting, and her condition was baffling. They had a Jane Doe on their hands, and the story of the note from the long-lost runaway mother seemed deeply implausible and reeked of deception. The medical staff, particularly the head physician, Dr. Albert Reiter, made a series of crucial, heroic decisions. They insisted on seeing the mother, recognizing that her medical history was essential to saving the girl's life. They contacted the police, and they went to the media. They made a powerful public appeal, broadcasting on television and in newspapers, pleading for the mother of this critically ill young woman to come forward. The appeal worked with devastating effectiveness. Fritzl saw it on the news. He knew the net was closing, that the outside world was now looking for a ghost he had kept hidden for 24 years. Elizabeth, watching the news on a small television in the cellar, also saw the appeal for her to come forward to save her daughter's life. The pressure on Fritzl became unbearable. On April 26th, in a final desperate act, he released Elizabeth from the cellar for the first time in 24 years, along with her two other cellar children, Stefan and Felix. His plan was to force her to go to the hospital and stick to the cult story, hoping her appearance would quell the doctor's suspicions. But he had catastrophically underestimated the power of a mother's love and the weight of 24 years of pent-up truth. When the police, alerted by the hospital, found Elizabeth at the house, they made a promise that would change everything. They separated her from her father and guaranteed her that she would never have to see him again if she told them the unvarnished truth. In a long, harrowing interview that lasted for hours, the dam finally broke. Elizabeth, the pale, broken woman who had not seen the sun since she was a teenager, told the police everything. The story that emerged was so horrific, so unbelievable, that the seasoned officers initially struggled to comprehend it. The secret of the cellar was finally, irrevocably. Chapter 7, The Trial in the Glare of the World, the trial of Josef Fritzl, which began in the regional court of St. Pölten, Austria, in March 2009, was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a global media event. It was one of the most highly anticipated and intensely scrutinized trials of the 21st century. The world's media descended on the small Austrian city, turning the courthouse and the surrounding streets into a fortress besieged by satellite trucks and journalists. The charges against Fritzl were immense and almost medieval in their horror. Murder for the death of the infant Michael, who died shortly after birth in the cellar due to his refusal to seek medical help. Slavery, rape, thousands of counts, incest, false imprisonment, and coercion. Fritzl entered the courtroom on the first day, attempting to hide his face from the cameras behind a large blue binder, a fragile and pathetic shield against the glare of the global spotlight. Initially, he adopted a strategy of partial confession and defiance. He pleaded guilty to the charges of incest, rape, and false imprisonment, acts he could no longer deny. But he defiantly pleaded not guilty to the far more serious charges of murder and slavery. His legal strategy was to portray himself not as a monstrous, calculating slave master and murderer, but as a man who had made a terrible mistake, someone who had lost control due to a difficult past. In his opening statements, he tried to argue that he was not a monster, that he had brought the cellar children presents and a Christmas tree, a grotesque attempt to normalize the unspeakable. The turning point of the trial, the moment that shattered Fritzl's arrogant composure and sealed his fate, was the presentation of the key piece of evidence from the prosecution, Elizabeth's testimony. To spare her the profound trauma of having to face her father in court, her testimony had been pre-recorded over many hours. For 11 hours, the court watched the video. The jury, the judge, the lawyers, and Fritzl himself listened in rapt, horrified silence as Elizabeth, with a quiet, devastating dignity, recounted the 24 years of horror she had endured. She spoke of the suffocating darkness, the constant rapes, the painful births in the squalor of the cellar, and most heartbreakingly, of holding her infant son, Michael, as he struggled for breath for 66 hours and died in her arms, while her father, her captor, refused to get medical help. The effect of the testimony on Josef Fritzl was profound and immediate. For the first time, he was forced to confront his actions, not from his own narcissistic, self-justifying perspective, but through the clear, unwavering eyes of his victim. The carefully constructed walls of his self-deception seemed to visibly crumble before the court. The day after the testimony was shown, something fundamental shifted. He returned to court a changed man, his face ashen, his arrogance gone. When the judge asked for his plea, his lawyer stood and announced that he was changing his plea to guilty on all counts, including murder and slavery. Fritzl himself then spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I regret it with all my heart. I can't make it right anymore." Whether this was a moment of genuine remorse or simply the cold realization that the game was lost remains a matter of intense debate. On March 19, 2009, the jury found him guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison, to be served in a secure psychiatric institution. The door of a new and final prison had slammed shut behind him. Chapter 8, The Monster in a Cage. Following his conviction, Josef Fritzl was incarcerated at the Kremstein prison, one of Austria's highest security facilities, and housed in a special unit for the criminally insane. The man who had been the absolute god of his own small, dark universe was now just inmate number W13132, stripped of all power, all control, and all identity outside of his crimes. His life behind bars became a subject of morbid curiosity, with sporadic reports leaking out to a public that remained fascinated by the psychology of the monster. In the initial years of his imprisonment, reports from prison insiders suggested that Fritzl remained arrogant and largely unrepentant, despite his dramatic courtroom confession. He reportedly tried to exert control over other inmates and guards, failing to grasp that his reign as a domestic tyrant was over. He was said to be obsessed with his own media coverage, meticulously collecting newspaper clippings about his case. In his mind, he was not a depraved criminal, but a world-famous, misunderstood figure, a victim of circumstance and his own difficult upbringing. There was little evidence of the profound remorse he had claimed to feel at his trial. His primary emotion seemed to be self-pity. As the years passed, however, the inexorable toll of age and incarceration began to show. Reports emerged that he was suffering from dementia, that his physical and mental health were rapidly deteriorating. He became a frail, confused, and increasingly isolated old man, a ghost of the domineering, terrifying figure he once was. In a final, symbolic attempt to escape the monstrous identity he had created, he legally changed his surname to Meyerhoff, hoping to live out his final years in the anonymity he had denied his daughter for a lifetime. But the name Fritzl was too deeply seared into the public consciousness to ever be forgotten. For the family he so utterly destroyed, the journey after their release was one of trying to rebuild lives from the rubble of an unimaginable and unprecedented trauma. Elizabeth and her 6 surviving children were taken to a secluded clinic, shielded from the intense and predatory media spotlight by the Austrian state. They were given new identities and a new home, in a secret location in the Austrian countryside, a place with sunlight and open space. They began the long, arduous, and lifelong process of healing, of learning to live in a world that was entirely new to some of them. The children who had grown up in the cellar had to learn the most basic things about the world. What rain feels like, what a car is, how to walk on grass, how to interact with other people. Their story is one of incredible, almost superhuman resilience, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of a mother's love in the face of absolute darkness. While the monster lived out his days in a cage of his own making, his former captives began the slow, painful, but ultimately hopeful process of reclaiming their lives from the abyss. Chapter 9. The Architecture of Tyranny. To dissect the mind of Josef Fritzl is to enter a psychological landscape of absolute, suffocating tyranny. It is a mind built on the foundations of malignant narcissism and a profound, cold-blooded psychopathy. He was not mad in the legal sense. He was not detached from the reality he observed. On the contrary, he was the meticulous architect and engineer of his own reality, a world designed to serve a single, all-consuming purpose, the complete and total domination of others to feed his pathologically grandiose sense of self. The core of his pathology was a severe and textbook narcissistic personality disorder. He possessed a God complex, a deeply ingrained belief that he was superior to all others, and that the normal rules of morality, ethics, and law simply did not apply to him. This impenetrable fortress of grandiosity was a defense mechanism built around the fragile, humiliated, and powerless child he claimed to have once been. Having been a victim of tyranny, he dedicated his entire life to becoming the ultimate tyrant. His family was not a collection of individuals to be loved and nurtured, but an empire to be ruled, and Elizabeth became the ultimate colonial territory, a subject to be conquered, owned, and exploited for his sole gratification. Layered over this was a profound psychopathic lack of empathy, a chilling inability to see his daughter and his children as human beings with feelings, rights, or an existence independent of his own. They were objects, extensions of his will, possessions. This explains his chilling and almost inhuman ability to compartmentalize his life. He could ascend the stairs from the cellar, where he had just committed acts of unspeakable brutality, and seamlessly step into the role of the family man. He could have dinner with Rosemary and the upstairs children, watch television, and act the part of a normal husband and grandfather, all while his other family languished in darkness and squalor just below. This was not a double life in the traditional sense of a man torn between two worlds. It was a single, fully integrated life in which both the upstairs and the downstairs served the same master, his insatiable ego. His engineering background was not incidental to his crimes. It was instrumental to his pathology. He applied the same cold, calculating, problem-solving logic he used in his profession to the construction of his dungeon and the decades-long management of his prisoners. He was a project manager of human suffering. The reinforced doors, the complex locking mechanisms, The ventilation systems, the carefully constructed alibis, the manipulation of his wife and the authorities, all were products of a rational, methodical and intelligent mind dedicated to an utterly irrational and evil purpose. He was not a monster who lost control. He was a monster whose entire life was a meticulous and obsessive exercise in control. The cellar was not just a physical space. It was a perfect and terrifying metaphor for his own mind, sealed, hidden, airless, and completely devoid of light. Chapter 10. The Banality of a Monster. The case of Josef Fritzl will forever stand as one of the most disturbing and morally significant in the annals of modern crime, not because of its public spectacle or its mystery, but because of its horrifying, suffocating simplicity. It is a story about the absolute corruption of power within the most intimate and supposedly safe of human settings, the family. Fritzl's house at 40 Ibstrasse became a dark and enduring symbol, a terrifying reminder that the most monstrous acts do not require elaborate conspiracies, hidden lairs in remote forests or exotic locations. They can unfold year after year, day after day, behind a neat facade on a quiet street, in a town just like any other. His legacy is the profound and lasting sense of unease he left behind. He shattered our most comforting assumptions about the sanctity of the home and the fundamental nature of parental love. He demonstrated, in the most graphic way imaginable, that a human being can be systematically stripped of their humanity, not by a totalitarian state or a vast institution, but by a single individual driven by a pathological need for control. He is the ultimate and most extreme example of domestic tyranny, a story that forces us to wonder about the secrets that may be hidden behind our neighbor's well-maintained closed doors. The cellar has been filled with concrete now. The house has been sold and renovated, an attempt by the town to erase the physical scar from its landscape. But the questions raised by the Fritzl case remain, echoing in the darkness he created. We are left to contemplate the very nature of evil itself. Fritzl was not a drooling, obvious monster from a horror film. He was a man who went to work, paid his taxes, raised a family, and was a member of the local fishing club. This banality of evil, a concept articulated by the philosopher Hannah Arendt, the idea that the most horrific acts can be committed by people who appear utterly, terrifyingly ordinary, is perhaps the most enduring and unsettling lesson of this case. It suggests that the capacity for such profound darkness is not something alien or other, but something disturbingly human. And so, we are left with the final, haunting question that this case forces us to confront. A question that looks back to the loveless, abusive home of his own youth. Is a monster like Josef Fritzl born from a fundamental defect within, a seed of evil that was always destined to sprout? Or is he forged, slowly and deliberately, piece by painful piece, in the cold, dark and silent cellar of his own childhood? If this story has intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to explore other true crimes that have shocked the world and the minds behind them.